You can go, yeah.
Is it going?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Welcome all to this edition of this PGWiP session. This evening we are very pleased to welcome Laura Bigoni. Laura has just started her PhD in Strasbourg. I'm in the Faculty of Catholic Philology, working on shame in the Greek Bible, which she's going to speak to us a little bit about today. Before that, though, Laura completed her master's at the University of Bologna in philology, and before that, her undergraduate in classics with a year in Erasmus year at our very own UCL.
Yes.
So,
Nice to be back.
welcome back.
Thank you.
And so, without further ado, Laura is going to share her research with us. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome and thank you for being here. I would like to thank the organizers, and especially Anna Lucia, who's not here today, but for letting me be in London again. It's a real pleasure to be here. I must disappoint you straight away because it's written that I come from the University of Bologna, but it was, I think, a mistake of mine, probably. But I'm currently affiliated in Strasbourg, so this is where I work. So I would like to start by saying 2 words on the broader project that my PhD is part of. And this is a project led by a team from the theological faculties of the universities of Strasbourg and Oxford. And it has the aim of producing a new lexicon of the Septuagint that is going to be called the Historical and Theological Lexicon of the Septuagint, and will feature articles on the most prominent lemmas that appear in the Septuagint vocabulary to express central ideas, but also realian of the Jewish cultural world. And these articles are different from the already existing dictionaries because they follow the history of the word from its appearance in classical literature, so in classical Greek literature, down to the use of church fathers. So we try to encompass the whole history of the word and put it in a context. And this approach of setting a biblical lemma in its context within the Greek language, and the articles also include the presence of the word in papyri and inscriptions, so it's really a broad context. So this approach wants to follow the steps of the French tradition of studies on the Septuagint, and I especially think about the works by Professor Harle and Professor Derival from the University of Paris. And they highlight how the peculiarities that make the Septuagint language sound a little odd to classicists, to Greek specialists, mostly have to do with syntactical strategies that come from the source language, from Hebrew, but not so much with lexical choices. So we can still work on lexical choices from the classicist point of view as well. And most of the so-called biblical neologisms have been found recently in papyri inscriptions, so we can trace them back to the natural development of the Greek koine in Hellenistic times. So within this project, some specific concepts are being investigated in depth, and especially those that have an anthropological or theological relevance so the ones where the choice of one wording instead of another may suggest a conscious interpretation, a conscious or maybe not conscious cultural shift from what is meant in the Hebrew text and what is translated, and even some exegetical interventions of the translators. So it is in this frame that I set my work on the concept of shame and the relative word families. And since my research is at a very early stage, I would really like to discuss with you and I would like you to challenge my assumptions and the data I'm working on. So I will start by saying something about the methodological issues that I am facing in this kind of lexical research. So first of all, I need to confront two different mindsets and interact with translation studies, because we know that as classicists, we study a culture that is far from ours in time and space. So we face, all of us face, the difficulty of translating. But in the case of the study of the Greek Bible, we are confronted with an even deeper layer of misconception, possible misconceptions, because we deal with translating a translation. And before any analysis of how a certain concept or feeling was expressed in the target language, we must try to capture which was the translator's understanding of the source text, and at the same time, the importance of the source text to the translator, and then consequently, his interpretation of the source text. And in this effort, it is really important to keep in mind the ways, like why the translation was made in the first place, the ways in which Jewish Hellenistic people, or rather the Greek-speaking Jews, use the tool of translation to appropriate the concepts and values of their mother's culture in order for them to be meaningful in the new context of the diaspora, so in the Hellenistic time, where everyone spoke Greek. And under this aspect, I follow the work of Professor Rajak. She has shown how the whole process of translating the Bible into Greek can be interpreted from a social point of view as a way of identifying a specific community, and at the same time of seeing how the members of the community were willing to introduce themselves in a new culture, in the Greek world. And she writes, the very character of this special language, so of the language of the Septuagint in itself, served from the beginning as a means of self-identifying with the primary ethnic indicator, the language of the patria. And she writes these very interesting articles about the two coexisting needs that the Jews had in this period, that are going Greek, so setting themselves into the new culture, but at the same time staying Jewish. And these are the titles of these two chapters, and I find them, I would recommend them. It's a very nice reading. So the language of the Septuagint would thus be a response to these contrasting needs. And the endeavor of creating a new self-expression in a foreign language was not a very easy task for diaspora Jews. And it involved a good knowledge of the target language and culture, and self-conscious of their own culture, and a strong will to maintain this balance between the two. So we face a process of intercultural translation, not just interlinguistic translation. And this has brought the translators to the conscious creation of a new Greek language for the purpose of actualization and diffusion of sacred text, and the purpose of maintenance of cultural values and rights in the context of exile. So we can say that, in a way, even if they didn't have our tools and our interests, ancient translators confronted with similar problems because they worked to translate concepts, stories, laws, and most importantly, their relationship to God, that were very specific to their Jewish culture, into the language that was at the time a universal language, that is Koine Greek. So they had to adjust, like in every translation, the vocabulary and the structure of the Greek language to Jewish ideas, and try to go Greek while staying Jewish. So this operation that is very complex needs to be considered when we confront the text from the point of view of semantics, like we do in lexical research. Another issue that I'm facing is that shame is a human emotion, and it is also a social one. So it is felt in contexts that prove meaningful to the relationship between the self and society. And so I need to define it and consider the impact that this emotion has on the self, and most importantly, in the Bible, in the relationship between the self and God. So I need some theological background. So I need to problematize the definition of shame, what it is, and how do we define it? How do we distinguish it from other similar emotions, such as guilt or humiliation, that are very similarly expressed? And even when we agree on a definition, is this definition in some ways cultural specific, or is it universal? And can we start from our concepts, shame, or I think about the Italian, because I'm Italian, vergogna. So can we start from what we think, what we define in our languages to understand what is defined in the Greek text? And here I decided to isolate word families. So start from the lexical ways that are used in the Septuagint, and I isolated 4 of these families that are the most common. But I am aware that I am risking the omission of idiomatic expressions, metonymies, other ways that can express shame in different contexts. So this is a problem again. But I would say that my interest is more linguistic than anthropological. So I hope that this will work. So I will cite the 4 verbs, but I also include the nouns and adjectives from the same root. These are aischiuno, entrepo, oneidizo, and aideomai, which is very rare. And this is the first one I concentrated on, and I will talk about it to you. So these families serve as translation of mainly 2 Hebrew roots, which are then which present themselves in 10 different words derived from the roots, namely bosh, that is a very neutral feeling of shame, and is normally expressed in the passive when it's a verb, as if shame was something that is suffered by the self. And then the root hafar, which is nice. It's a polysemous root with the meaning of digging normally. So it's used in a way that's similar to the Italian, I'm so ashamed that I would like to dig myself under the earth. I don't know, you have something in English that's similar. And then we have oneidizo, that is mostly used in the causative meaning of outraging someone. But the noun from the same root, oneidismos, appear to signify something similar to the more common aischiuno as well. And then we have compounds, kataischiuno and epaischiuno, also attested with a causative meaning, and they are normally attributed to God in the active form. So aischiuno means shame, and is especially used to express a condition that is shameful or inconvenient or distressing, both in the historical and prophetical books. And it's the most common way of expressing shame. Even in classical and Hellenistic Greek, it's the most widely used term. And it's not linked to any specific genre or context. And it's also very common in papyri and inscriptions, which shows that it was popular and used. And it's used to translate, so in the Septuagint, it is used to translate the whole range of Hebrew terms that we briefly mentioned. And this is normally seen as a sort of stereotypical translation. So it's a process that is very common in translation, and it means that from a source text that is very authoritative, we create a correspondence that is direct between one word and another word from the source language and the target language. And this in the Septuagint usually happens when there's a very important passage in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books, that then all the other translators just remembered and used so that they use the same word as a sign of understanding the same concept. And this should be the case with aischiuno, and we can see that by the time of the translation, it was the only way that people used, that translators used to express this complex word. So it's very difficult to understand if they understood different nuances of the Hebrew text, but then stereotyped or maybe not. Maybe they just decided to use one specific word. So now I will briefly introduce 3 examples that you find in your handout of the analysis on specific passages. These are still ongoing analyses, but they seem to me promising under 3 different points of view that I will try to express. So the first may lead to some observation on the interaction between different translators of different books. So we can challenge the idea of stereotyping. The second one is more on the use of synonyms and doublets in the same translation. And the third goes more on the interplay between Hebrew and Greek. So the first one is the very first passage where shame is attested in the Septuagint, and it's very early in the text, so the second chapter of Genesis. And what I find interesting in this passage is that we always think about the original sin of Adam and Eve as something really shameful, and I was thinking of finding a very strong way of expressing this, but actually the shame of this original sin is expressed in the negative form, and not when the sin happens, but before. So it's mentioned when Adam and Eve still don't know, and so they cannot feel shame. So they don't know that they are creatures, they don't know that they are nude, they don't know that they are mortal as well. So they do not participate in a social life in a way, and they cannot feel a social emotion like shame. And this appears just right before this blissful condition is about to end forever. So as you can see, they say, the author says, they were not ashamed because they didn't know. This passage is really interesting for its uniqueness, but also because it's collocated at the very beginning of the book. And the link of shame and knowledge is direct, but as I said, expressed in this paradoxical way where Adam and Eve never really experienced shame. So in this case, we see also another element that is going to be central to the concept of shame in the Septuagint, that is nudity, that is normally associated with the feminine element. But interestingly, the Pentateuch expresses this idea of the shameful condition of being naked with another root, that is askemosiune, so that means something inappropriate. But it never mentions again this bosh, this aiskune, this shame. So it looks like the authors of the rest of the Pentateuch try to hide, in a way, silence this original irreparable shame sin. So they don't ever mention the same root again. They avoid it simply. So it's like no one else can feel shame in the Septuagint, in the Pentateuch, because the human condition is already shameful, and we already know that from the very beginning. So I think that the authority of this passage on later definitions and translations of shame is not in doubt. And so it is not impossible to think that this unique example may have been sufficient for all later translators to interpret any form of shame as kind of recalling this original primordial shame. So this would not mean exactly stereotyping, but rather more or less intentionally recalling the authoritative text. And concerning this passage, I think there's an interesting comment in a work by Philo, who's always commenting on specific passages of the Septuagint. And this one comes from the Nomon Hieron Allegoriae, second book, which deals with passages from the Genesis. So here Philo seeks to present the history of the first man as a symbol of the development of the soul, and in his reasoning, Eve represents the beginning of sensation. So that's why even shame is linked with the woman. And I find this passage very interesting because he's commenting on the specific passage we read, and here aiskune is reduced, like the wording of the Septuagint is reduced to 3 components, one of which is eidos, this famous root that almost never appears in the Septuagint. So here eidos becomes a part of aiskune, a way of defining aiskune as a generic word that can be explained through eidos. And I think this is an example of like glossary to the common word that is used in the biblical text. So there's a very generic word in the biblical text, and then commentators analyze it and divide it into parts in order to explain it. And so I think that the nuances of the original are not lost, but simply they're not expressed in the text because there is a ongoing exegesis that then will flow into the rabbinic exegesis in the medieval times. So even Weingren here talks about rabbinic type commentary, that it's like closing in a way. And in this sense, we must remember that Philo is a very learned man, and he uses Greek in a very elaborated way, and he uses eidos much more than aiskune to point out this concept. So here we may see a shift in register more than a shift in meaning. So he wants to clarify with a more learned word the more general one. And we see, like, I ask myself why eidos is not attested in the Septuagint, and actually it appears 5 times, and all of them are in books that were already originally written in Greek, so they don't have a Hebrew equivalent. And there are 2 I put on your handout, point 3 and 4, and I would like to discuss with you. One is in the book of Proverbs. Here we have the Hebrew equivalent, the same root that we mentioned, kafar, to take oneself. And so the book of Proverbs makes us meet with another characteristic of the text, the Septuagint text, that recalls its long and intricate textual tradition, that is the presence of doublets, so double translations for the same Hebrew word. So this translation, like the book of Proverbs, is very free from the Masoretic text, from the Hebrew that we read today. And the translator is considered a very learned man who masters Greek and organizes his linguistic material very carefully. And the book itself appears as a collection of different collections of proverbs and other sayings. And one of the main characteristics, as I was saying, of this translation is the presence of many doublets as compared to other books. And here the expression where our verb appears happens to be one of these doublets. That is to say, the case in where one item of the Masoretic text is matched with 2 items in the Septuagint. So here as well, scholars discuss about which one of the 2 texts present the doublet. So is it original in the Hebrew text, or is it a Septuagint development? Probably it is a Septuagint development. In this case, we have the same expression in the Hebrew, but the different expression in the Septuagint. So in chapter 24-23, this is placed right at the beginning of the 4th collection of Proverbs. We see some changes in the order of the material from the Hebrew to the Greek, but we don't need to analyze it. And then chapter 28, that is right in the middle of the 2nd Solomonic collection. So the 2 Solomonic collections are much more linked to the source text, whereas the other parts of the book are more freely translated. So as I said, the two passages are identical in the Hebrew, and they are a kind of formulaic way of saying that partiality in judgment is not good. So this is the concept that is expressed. But then they are translated once with aiskeunomai and once with aideomai. So the idea is that you don't have to respect someone more than another one if you are a judge. So that means that everyone is equal in front of the law. So as I said, the first one is employed in the Solomonic collection, where the language is dependent much more on the source language. And it has a very similar passage in the first Solomonic collection, where the same idea is expressed with thaumazo, so taumazai prosopon. That means literally to look, to admire someone's face. And it's implied that if you admire someone's face more than the others, that means that you will not be a very good judge. But the expression with aideomai appears in a secondary collection. So here the translator operates more freely, and also what he wants to do is to harmonize the text. So he intervenes with a lot of he intervenes a lot in this part in order to make the text appear uniform. So I find it very puzzling to find the only occurrence of aideomai here. There are different possibilities. I don't know what you think to explain this. This one, as well as other doublets in the text, we could attribute them to a later revision, but we know that normally revisions try to go back to the source text as possible. So this would mean that the other one has been revised. So to bring it closer to the Hebrew forlage and to the Septuagint expression, which would be normally aiskeunomai. Or we could identify this kind of slip into a more sophisticated way, like more Greek way of expressing this partiality to the translator, by the translator, and his will of avoiding repetition, embellishing the text with this change. So in any case, I think this example is relevant to see the interplay of different ways of expressing the same idea inside the same work, and how this conception of one-to-one correspondence is a very, very poor tool to understand how the translators worked. And it does not work in either direction. So in the Genesis, it was the opposite way around. But here we see that the same expression is translated in two ways. We can come to the third example that is taken from the book of Judith. Here, the central question of the book is, and it's still highly debated, I don't have an answer for this. We don't have any forlage, any Hebrew for the book of Judith, but we don't know whether it was originally written in Greek or it had a Hebrew forlage. And the passage that I selected is interesting to me because it's the only one where all the roots appear all together, like in the same passage. It's like a very concise way of saying that this condition is really, really shameful. And so I think that the appearance of aideomai here can be a little, very, very tiny hint of this book being originally written in Greek. So I think that recent contributions from Schmidt, for example, they point to this Greek origin, influenced, of course, by the authoritative language of the other books of the Septuagint. So it's like at this stage, like in the first century, the Septuagint language was already very common, and people could use it to produce new Greek texts from scratch. So we don't need to pretend that there was a Hebrew forlaget for this one. So if we consider that Aiscuno may come from this standard translation after the passage of Genesis, here we see that it is used in a context that is not very common, which is the context of shameful nudity, which normally would have another way of expression. And here it's particularly used to describe a rape. So I see here a kind of concentration of all these roots, and it's a very macabre setting. And the context of the passage sees Judith praying for the Lord's help in delivering his people through her action. She's going to murder the leader of the Assyrians very soon. And the prayer is situated at the pitch of the plot. It's very intense. And so here the portrait of the enemy is like the worst possible. And this imagery of the deeds of the enemies is incredibly vivid. And this explains maybe why here we find these substantives concerning shame of being raped. And naturally, I want to point out for the girls like me that shame is felt by the woman, of course. So here we find miasma, the contamination, aiscune, this common way of saying it, and then the oneidismos, kind of disregard inflicted on the victim. And so here, this description, I think, does not belong to the straightforward way of expressing things in the Septuagint language. And also it's puzzling because of the explicit connection between nudity and shame expressed with aiscuno that is not normally the case. So of course I don't want to rush to conclusions, but maybe this can point to a Greek origin of the book. So I think in the end our questions are mostly left open, and they can give us another chance of reflecting why is Eidos Septuagint. Does this depend on different contexts or different linguistic nature? What I want to do, and I still need to do, is analyzing the usage of Eidos in Hellenistic Greek. There's a very good monograph on the usage of Eidos in classical Greek, but it stops with the sophists and Plato and Aristotle. So I would like to see if in later works it's still used and how. I know that in papyri it is very rare, so it's probably in use, but just in some very sophisticated context. So from a linguistic point of view, I can try to make the assumption that aiscune is preferred also because it is simple, straightforward, and Eidos was felt like a more elevated way of saying this. And yeah, so I think that with these few examples, I just wanted to underline how this linguistic operation of the Septuagint translator is not normally a casual one, but it's still very difficult to discuss, but how lexical choices matter. So they don't just matter to spot the translator's ignorance of Greek, as we usually do, but also to appreciate their values, their intentions, and what mattered to them while they were translating this text that were fundamental to them. I really thank you for your attention.